Good morning, and thank you very much for attending this morning session, How to Talk About ALS with Your Family, Friend, and Job. I'm Kayvon Freeman, registered nurse working with ALS Association, Greater New York Chapter as a Patient Services Coordinator. I also cover a clinic at Mount Sinai and Hospital for Special Surgery. Please make sure that you write your questions on the Zoom question answers, and we try to get to all of it. If not, somehow we will get back to you as soon as we can with the answer. This is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Melinda Cavanaugh. She is licensed clinical social worker and associate professor in social work at Helen Bader School of Social Welfare of the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Cavanaugh is a leading expert in young caregivers and principal investigator for numerous research studies on families living with neurological disorder, including Huntington disease and ALS. She has worked with numerous number of ALS associations around the country, and she has presented her work both nationally and internationally. She has written several books for children, young adults, and families living with ALS. We are very fortunate to have Melinda today, and thank you so much for taking this session. Thank you. Take it from here.
Take it away. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for that really lovely introduction. So I am going to talk about kind of broadly how to talk about ALS. So obviously, my primary area is really around children and families and communicating in that area, if you will. I'll expand it to talk about friends. I'm going to use quite a bit of my current research and ongoing research in this presentation. I do my best to use the voices of the families, the children, the folks who are living with ALS, so that we really situate it in their own personal experiences. I know that work was included as part of this, but in all honesty, I'm not going to talk much about work because it's a very sensitive area and I am not a legal expert. And I want to make sure that there aren't any misleading suggestions or ideas about how to talk to your employer. That said, many of the suggestions in this slide might absolutely apply to your work environment. But again, that is not my area of expertise, and I don't want to confuse anyone and make any suggestions that might not end up being helpful in that work environment. So I'm going to start off by just acknowledging how very difficult this topic can be. Oftentimes when individuals and families have talked to me about this, they feel very overwhelmed and scared. They often feel helpless because it is such an overwhelming conversation to have, regardless of whom you're having the conversation with. Often people feel like, I don't need to say anything, or I need to say everything. I'm not sure what to say. I just have no idea how to proceed with this conversation. So I just wanted to situate it and acknowledge how complicated it is, acknowledge that everybody is going to move through this topic, this idea of telling people about ALS in their own way. And I'm going to bring that up many times through this conversation because I think that that's the most important piece, is that, you know, I have lots of suggestions. I have lots of feedback from other families, but you are your own person and you need to be very thoughtful and careful with yourself and how you move forward with this conversation. So I'm going to situate it in the telling. And I use this because many families have described it in this way, that it's the telling, and that often it feels like it's this big thing because what you're doing is disclosing. And this is where the work piece comes in. You might need to, share with your employer that I have this illness and that there are very few treatments and cures or no cures, very few things available to help me move through this process. So it can feel very heavy, like you're making a huge disclosure. Oftentimes people describe it as I'm telling someone that something is wrong or something is off with me. And that sometimes that telling is an ask for help. But it can very much be just a desire to share, and that desire to be closer to someone, whether it's a family member or a friend. And that there are many individuals living with ALS who don't feel that this idea of the telling is such a huge deal, because it's really a part of your life. It is who you are now. And so I want to recognize that this idea of telling people you have ALS, you have been diagnosed, maybe you have progressed, and there are certain things that have changed, often dramatically, that this telling really encompasses a lot of different areas, from a very formal disclosure to your work to simply saying, it's just who I am right now. And what I mean by covering all of these areas is going back to what I said at the beginning. It is who you are, and it's at your pace and your process. So when you think about how do I do this telling, there are many questions that I highly encourage you to think about. So what do you need to know? Right? Do you need to know more about ALS? What does it mean? Where did it start on you? Do you have a bulbar onset? Is it to do with your limbs right away? What is it that I need to know more about ALS so that I can share with others? And also, very much first and foremost, is how do you feel? And it is okay, whatever you feel. You can feel angry, you can feel upset, you can feel disappointed, you can feel frustrated, all of those things, understanding, how do I feel about that? Am I scared to tell people? What might people's reactions be? And we have some conversation later about that. And something that doesn't get brought into it is, what does my culture say? And what I mean by that is my community, my belief system. And this can be related to spirituality. It can be related to religion. It can be related to my immediate culture, my group that I identify with. So it's very important to kind of sit with that and say, how do my belief systems influence how I tell people? And that includes how I tell my children. And again, we'll spend some time on that. But I don't think this gets enough kind of conversation in what's important in my belief system, in my world around me, in my community. What do I believe? And how do I incorporate that in telling someone that I have a disorder like ALS? And it might not be important to you at all, but it might be extremely important. And one of the reasons why I bring this up is oftentimes people find the most support in their religious or spiritual or cultural community. So when it comes to figuring out how to say it, what words to use, who to tell, oftentimes we go to that religious or spiritual community for that support. So I didn't want to leave that out of this conversation, and I put it at the beginning of the talk so that it can be in the back of our minds as we move forward. And lastly, it's very important to know, why are you telling? Who knows if I should know? And that's a typo, my apologies. But when you think about why are you telling, there's the work piece, right? Are you unable to get the work done that you need to do? So there's a very specific reason there. Is it my children are wondering what's going on? Or is it I need to share because it's important to me? these are all very individual reasons, and I encourage you all to kind of sit with them and ask yourself, what are the reasons behind the telling, so that then you can be prepared and have the conversation. And my last introductory slide is just to reiterate everything I've said. And for those of you who are out there listening to this, who are living with ALS, please know that you absolutely deserve to have the time with all of these kinds of questions. Don't hesitate to seek any guidance from your counselors, from the ALSA staff, from your family, friends. And as I said before, any religious or spiritual or cultural leaders. Those are often incredibly helpful individuals. Whomever you have in your life who can walk you through these questions, and that there's no set timeline and it's your timeline. And there's also no one way to tell or disclose or share. I'm going to have lots of suggestions in this PowerPoint, but that's all they are suggestions. And I just want to continue bring it back to encourage everyone to think about their own timing, their own feelings, and their own experiences. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is something I spend the majority of my time on, and that's how to talk with children. Here's the cover of a book that I wrote many years ago, and it has so many different suggestions. It has so many great examples, and it has the words of families. And I put this up there so that you can get this online, you can get this in hard copy. And the point is that you're not alone in trying to figure out how to talk to your children about ALS. And if you need anything to kind of help walk you through it, this book is available, and the chapter will be able to help you get a copy of that. And one thing I said, I want to always situate it. These are two different quotes. One was a family member who emailed this to me to say, thank you for including the children, because ALS affects the whole family. And the second quote is someone who's part of an ongoing research project that I'm doing, who said, you know what, when it comes down to it, those younger kids, those children under 10, they always ask the great questions. And they do, because they ask the direct questions. They don't have all the filters that adults do. So we'll go over that more, but this helps you see that people are always asking, they're saying, please include the children. They ask good questions. It's important. But it's also really important to understand why some parents really struggle with talking about ALS. And these are things that parents have told me in my research when I've asked them. They are concerned about children thinking about it. They think their kids are too young. But probably the most important one is the one here, I don't know what to say. And that's a really important piece, because when we think about what children know or don't know, I've also asked this in my research, and some of them have tons of knowledge. They know that it's a disease and it's about paralyzing and muscles and all of these things. But then some kids just have no idea. It broadly stops the body. It's rare for a girl to get it because they only see men having it. So the truth is that there's a lot of misinformation or non-information with children and youth. And what youth tell me in my research is they do want to know, and they want to know from their family member. So I put this out there to help alleviate some of those fears and concerns when it comes to, why should I be doing this? How should I talk to them? Know that children and youth really do want to know, and they want to hear from you. So then people say, but how do I do it? And there are lots of hows, right? This is one suggestion. But I think it's a very important one, because all I'm saying here is to start the conversation. And when you do that, try not to approach it as like the huge telling, right? You're in your telling, you're doing a telling, but make it very normal. You're at dinner, you're watching TV. Ask them if they have some questions about what's going on. Acknowledge that things have changed. Maybe you're unable to do some of the things you used to be able to do. Do they have questions about that? And it's really, really important to be very basic and be very open, right? And to be honest. And this is extremely hard, because as we'll talk about in the slide, we always want to protect our children, and we don't want to harm them. We don't want to scare them. We don't want to freak them out. But in the end, you do know your child best. So don't push it if it's something that the child is being very reticent about, but also don't be afraid to just start the conversation. And you don't have to have the first conversation being 45 minutes long with the most intense conversation ever. Just ask, do they have any questions? What do they know? What do they not know? Have they noticed anything? Very basic things. And you might be a parent that has a child that they don't want to talk about it. And that is perfectly fine. And you might have a child who says, I don't want to talk about it now, and I'm not sure that I want to talk about it in the future. And again, that's absolutely a possibility. But if that's the key, make sure that you are also engaging school personnel, your clergy, your spiritual leaders, your community friends, your family, somebody else that child or youth might be comfortable going to, so that when they do have those questions, they can get them answered. And it's okay to engage other people. Even though children and youth tell us they want to hear from their parents, maybe this is something that you're going to want to engage someone else. But also consider that oftentimes children and youth don't go to their parent because they sense that you're uncomfortable, which is very common. But think about it. Think about, what is it that you are uncomfortable with? How do you feel? Make sure that you're taking the time to kind of process through those telling questions so that you're at a comfortable place when you can have those conversations. Then there's this, which is asking a question that you're not prepared to answer, which is very likely to happen. But think about, how do you want to talk about it? Like, what might make you comfortable? Is that getting more information for yourself? Is it being kind of vulnerable to your youth by saying, okay, well, here's what makes me uncomfortable, right? I'm going to talk to you about something that makes me feel a little uncomfortable, that, the loss of something that I've experienced because of ALS. And when you're honest and you aren't afraid to answer those questions, then you're, in a weird way, a little more prepared to answer, and they're a little more open to hear because they see your vulnerability as well. And it's also okay to say, I don't really have the answer to that. But think about that in advance. What can you get from the ALS Association? What can you get from the series of books that I've written that I'll show you at the end of this? What can you get from your friends and your family, your religious leaders? Think about that in advance, because you probably are going to get a question you aren't prepared or you don't have the answer for. So being able to tell your child or your youth, we're going to figure this out as we go along. I don't have the answer right now, but I will get it. Then we get to this part about protecting, and I absolutely understand it. The impulse is to protect, is to not harm them or scare them or freak them out. And it's not necessarily protecting them by not telling them. And think about why you're protecting them, or what is it that's behind that protection. And almost always it's because the family member, the parent, they just don't know what to say. And that's, again, engage a trusted source, a counselor, the ALS Association, a friend. Do mock conversations. Sit down with a friend or a family member and say, okay, act it out. You're my 12-year-old. Ask me some really tough questions. And that'll help you prepare for how to know what to say. But maybe you do know that you know your child and they are not going to handle it well. And so your protecting them is really a positive parental response. Again, engage with a trusted individual. How might you best approach this? And maybe you're not the best one to approach it, right? But if you think that what you really are behind that protection is, I just don't want them to know. I just don't want them to know. That's a very normal response, but I have a lot of caution around that because I've seen it. I have absolutely seen it where in the future, it fosters a sense of almost resentment or disrespect, where youth have said, you know, they didn't trust me enough to tell me. They didn't love me or care for me enough to tell me. And I know that that is not the point, but that's often how it can be felt by these youth. So if there's one thing I can really push home out of all of this is communicate. Communicate honestly, communicate openly, and engage as many other people in that conversation as you can who are really there to show you that support, give you that guidance, give you those suggestions, and maybe be that second person that your child or youth would feel a little more comfortable going to. And the last thing I'll talk about in the children and youth realm is school. And this can be very, very difficult. I've put up here, we've actually written a guide that you can give to your school personnel to say, hey, look, I have this diagnosis. Here's a book. It shows them what ALS is, how they need to be thinking about paying attention to your child's behaviors, their emotions. Are things changing? Are they struggling in school? It gives that information, education, and support to the school personnel. Because if you think about it, that's where our children are the majority of time. And so because it can be very difficult, and especially in the world now with online education, having that opportunity to share that with the school is really critical. And I know that it can be very difficult, but particularly if it's a new diagnosis or if ALS has progressed, if they've moved to a new school, you know, don't hesitate to get a copy of this and give it to your school personnel, the school social worker, the school counselor, the school nurse, your child's teacher. It really helps them understand what's going on with that child or youth, because we do know that it absolutely affects their school performance and attendance. And if your child knows that your school is there to support them, then that's another layer of maybe someone they can talk to, but they don't, or they can't if the school doesn't understand what's happening. And here are the books that I talked about. They're developmentally, they were, written for different developmental stages. We have the kind of young adult at the end. The middle is a graphic novel written for young children. And then the one in red is for that really kind of complicated tween age. So please don't hesitate to ask your local chapter for either a hard copy or an electronic copy. They're available both ways. So the next topic I'm going to talk about is friends and other families. And I'm going to use a lot of quotes, particularly from individuals who have said, hey, this is a really tough topic, and here's how my friends and family have reacted. So I'm going to go back to the telling, right? What is it that you want people to know? Why do you need to tell them? And be very clear that the reactions you're going to get might vary. And a lot of families have talked to me about feelings of disappointment because of the variety of reactions that individuals get. But the key is, this is your story to tell, and it's not theirs. And you get to tell it, and you deserve all the support in doing so. So it might be telling a lifelong friend that this is what's going on in your life right now, and it's really overwhelming, and you might need their support. It might be telling your work friend whom you've just met or doesn't know, or maybe you don't know them that well. Go back to, what is it that you want to share? How do you feel about it? And what's that process going to look like? And the most important thing that individuals living with ALS tell me is to be prepared for a variety of reactions. And these can be all across the continuum. But the most important thing that I think is really important for people to remember is that when you tell someone that you have an illness like ALS, they'll hear it. But what it does is it very often brings up their own fears, concerns, questions about their own mortality. And that's not necessarily something that humans can immediately control, right? When we hear that someone has something that doesn't have, an immediate treatment or a cure, and they're very likely to die with this illness, that immediately gets your own mind running. What's going to happen to me? Do I have something? How am I going to get this? And it doesn't make people selfish. It makes people human. And so when I've asked individuals about this, this is what they say. They say, you know what? Sometimes a few friends have deserted me, but I knew that they had problems themselves. And so that doesn't excuse the fact that they make it more about them. What it does is it shows you that it's not about you. And so that's an important thing to remember, is that people very often overlay their own fears about their own mortality on you, and it has nothing to really do with you. I think my video froze, my apologies. But the other really important part is that people don't often react initially that reflects how they truly feel. And that goes back to that having their own fears and their own mortality. So recognizing that when you're doing the telling, that you might get an immediate response that might not be their true feeling. And whether it's a response of deep care and compassion and love for you, where they maybe get very emotional, be prepared for that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be super emotional throughout the whole process, but it's just that gut immediate reaction. So be thoughtful about that, and not necessarily in a way that you have to be their counselor, but just be prepared that that might be the response. You also might get, and sometimes people say this as well, that the family or the individual or the friend kind of pulls back for a minute, then they come back. And it can be very hard to kind of re-accept if someone has pushed you away initially. But I encourage you to think about that first point, that really it is about oftentimes people's acknowledging their own mortality, and they just don't know how to respond. And so the key is really to give people time. And it's hard, and it can be very difficult. And again, this is your own process, and you get to move through it in your own way. But if anything, this last quote is, I think, really helpful. This gentleman said, it certainly affected my interactions and my experiences, but what he says is it's actually greatly enhanced them, because that time was given for that person to kind of react, come back, maybe apologize, maybe say they didn't know how they were feeling. But if you're prepared for a variety of reactions, then it's going to make that telling and that moving forward and even telling about progression a little bit easier. And overall, when you tell, much like we said, or we talked about with the children, is it's so important to do the telling. And again, this is a very complicated thing because it's all in your own time. But when you're upfront and when you do tell people and when you do share that, it can absolutely help. Because much like with youth, we don't want to tell them because we're protecting them. Maybe we don't want to tell our friends or family because we're worried about their response. And we know that their response can cover a whole bunch of gamuts. But if we know that you can tell them and be upfront, and once it's clear, they can be very supportive and understanding. Plus, it helps really clear the air, because if there's someone like the earlier quote where they said they just needed to walk away, well, then you know that that's their response and they're going to have to walk away. But if you tell them, it can help. And you'll see by all of these quotes is that when you share that, people can be very caring and compassionate and open and supportive, and they can be very offering of help. And, the truth is that as it progresses, these responses can change, your feelings can change, your experience can change. But this is that point of you telling people, I have ALS, this is what this is, and this is how we're going to move forward. And something also that is a constant suggestion is to offer information and where to go for more education, because it shouldn't be incumbent on you to be the be all end all information person for all and everything about ALS, right? So refer them to ALS websites. Let them read up about it. Let them get some more information. Encourage your family and friends to do what you've been doing to take care of yourself, which is go to the ALS Association, go to their clergy, their spiritual leader, their religious home, their cultural community. Ask questions, encourage them to go and do their work so that when they come back to you, they have that information and they're ready to be there and support you. Because I know what very, very often happens is that the person living with ALS is now somehow the person who has to teach and educate everybody else about it. And many of you really enjoy that role. And so I highly encourage you to do that, but not everybody does. So maybe it's about encouraging your family and friends to go do some kind of research on their own so that you aren't having to just constantly teach them. And that's that can be a very tough spot. And it's, certainly a point of real encouraging discussion and open discussion. But I think in the end, if there's one takeaway, is that you take care of yourself, because I said it maybe 20 times, there's no one way to do this. There are suggestions and there are feedback from other people and other friends and families and your healthcare providers and the ALS Association. But you need to take care of yourself. And if that means stepping back from some of the invitations, as this first person quoted here, like they've been great, but sometimes I have to back away because it's too difficult. And if that's too emotionally difficult, or if that's too physically difficult, it doesn't matter. You're doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. And recognizing, as this second quote highlights, there's hills and there's valleys in all of this, whether it has to do with progression or whether it has to do with that emotional response of this is what I have, and I need to understand how to manage it or how to tell people that it's okay, that you're going to go through waves of grieving together and separately. And whether it's with your spouse or your friend or your family, it's truly, truly, truly about how you're taking care of yourself. So these are just a few implications for any of our healthcare providers who might be on the call. Most of these have to do with talking to children and youth, which I would say is probably the most complicated and the questions I get the most. But certainly for any of the healthcare providers on this call, I strongly encourage you to get the family talking, get them together, and it might take many sessions, but building that trust and building that community is so, so critical. And for all of you on the call, one more reminder, reach out to as many people as possible, as hard as it is, but when it feels right, even if it can be difficult to do. Your friends and your family, the ALS Association, your child's school, the community organizations, religious and spiritual homes. How to disclose and share something as large as a diagnosis of ALS should not be done in isolation, all by yourself, with no support and no help. It really should be as supportive and as engaged as absolute possible. So I feel like I've talked really fast. I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of time for any Q&As afterward. But first and foremost, I want to leave by thanking every single family and individual who has been a part of this conversation, who's been a part of my research, who's let me into their homes and their families. None of this would be possible without them. So I thank them and I thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing right now and I believe turn it over to Kayvon and start answering some of the questions. I see that there's a couple that have come in.
Okay, thank you so much. That was great and very informative. So I have one question that what happens if a family wants to talk to school, but the child asks, do not, sort of challenge them. Don't you dare come to my school.
Yes, yes. So, and I see that, yeah, that's absolutely, I think I probably get that question at every talk I give, which is such a critical question, because you want to be respectful of your child's privacy and their own kind of separateness that they feel at school. Because the reason why I think this is so important is that children feel a sense of respite when they're at school, right? They're away from the stressors of home. They're away from potential caregiving responsibilities. They're away from having to think about the intensity of this disease. So don't go to your school behind your child's back. Talk to your child first and say, here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to at least tell your school counselor, school social worker, or teacher, whomever it is, here's this book that we have. Here's some suggestions. Go to your child first. Don't do it behind their back. That can erode a lot of feelings of self-confidence they have. It can erode a lot of that anonymity that they feel in school. And if they're really, really adamant that they do not want anyone at school to know, then don't do it, because that's just going to harm that relationship your child has with you and with the school. But a big caveat, but make it very clear to your child or your youth, however old they are, that conversation has to keep happening, that, you love them and you care for them and you want to make sure that every part of their life is really supported, and that you're going to revisit it, right? So that it's not the be all end all, never again, but that you will revisit it, because like I said, school is where children are all day long and they need support, but you have to engage your child or youth in that. So it was a wonderful question. And Charisse, I appreciate you bringing it up.
Okay, thank you so much. And the other question is, how do I answer a question from my patient? She's a physician. She's been diagnosed since 1997. And before, she couldn't talk about it without crying, so she wrote cards to her friend. But how does she handle when the patient asks her, what's wrong with you?
Yeah. First of all, I want to acknowledge Adele. I believe I've got that name right. What a powerful way to do it is to write cards. And I'm going to remember that, if you don't mind. I'm going to bring that up in other talks that I give, because I think that's a wonderful way to do it. For your patients, I can only imagine that some of the concern or complications are your patients worried that you're going to be able to give the best care because you have ALS? Are you stopping providing care for them? That patient physician relationship is so important and so intrinsic to their well-being and yours as well. The suggestion I would have is to be very honest with them and just be as forthright as you feel comfortable. And maybe it's, a letter or a card might, for some people, feel less impersonal or more personal if you write it out. But I would make the suggestion that whatever you feel comfortable with, whether it's writing it out, calling, email, personal, that you do let them know, so that they can support you. Because I think we don't always give our patients enough credit for them wanting to support us as well. And so that would be my suggestion, is to certainly let them know.
So I have
there's two more.
Okay, there are two more. All right. You see I was going to present my question,
yeah. No.
Okay, so can you speak to young grandchildren 4 through 8?
Yes, I can. And actually, in that family book, if you can get a copy of it, there is a whole section that focuses explicitly on developmental age and stage and how to talk to children at those young ages. I didn't put it in this presentation. I just didn't have enough time. But in the book, there absolutely is. And particularly for the younger children, recognizing that their they're very black and white. They're very concrete thinkers. This happens, then this, and there's no gray in between. And so making sure that when you're talking with them, you're being very specific, very honest, and you're not giving a lot of flourishing. You're not giving a lot of gray, a lot of hypothetical. They aren't going to grasp that at all. So being very direct and very honest, but also not going into extreme detail, because these are the kids that are going to see, like, he's choking. What's going on there? They also have a sense of, did I do something to cause that? And we want to be really thoughtful and careful that it's very clear that you make it very clear to them that they didn't do anything, right? This isn't their fault. They weren't bad kids. They didn't cause this. And it sounds irrational for us as adults, but that's absolutely something that children think about. So if you can get a copy of that, either PDF or hard copy, there's an entire section just on age and developmental stage and how to talk about ALS with those younger kids.
Very good. Okay, the other one is, I'm very aware of the support group for the patients, and is any support group for the children of the patient with ALS?
So this is I think it's Jordan, I believe.
Yes.
Excellent question. And there are support groups for kids around the country. They're not everywhere. So if your chapter of the ALS Association, if they don't have a support group for children, go to them and ask them to help you set one up. And I've worked with many chapters across the country to help do this. There are other ways that children and youth can be supported. And I'll tell you, many years ago, when I was a budding social worker, I thought, I'm going to do a support group for kids who have a parent with Huntington's disease. And I put them in a circle and they were all supposed to talk and they all stared at each other and they were like, you're the worst person ever. So most kids do not enjoy like sitting in a group doing like a support group. So what I would encourage are activities. In many chapters, there's many examples. And actually, again, sorry to keep referring to the book, but the family guide at the end of it, there is several pages of suggested activities that children and youth can be a part of, that chapters can help develop and put into place, that aren't just sitting in a circle kind of staring at each other, but they're activities, going out, doing games, doing processes. I do, through my own research, I do a lot of work around like peer-to-peer grouping, and that is just critical. So in that book, there are some absolute suggestions. And Jordan, I love that the books touch on death and dying with dignity. Yes. All of my books immediately and inclusive talk about death and dying. There is no way to get around it with ALS. It's just not going to happen. And we have to be open and honest with our children in a way that's developmentally appropriate. So all of those books have a full chapter about death and dying, how to talk about it, and in a way that kind of normalizes it, if you will. And so Jordan, you have a 10 and 7-year-old. Absolutely. I would start with the graphic novel and let them kind of read through it. It's a very easy read. They're all real children. They're real things that children have said to me. So I would start with that, the family guide, but then also all the other books. We absolutely include everything around death and dying. Yeah.
In fact, our ALS Association in New York, we did have Children's Day. So we had a program for them according to their age group, and we invite them, and we had a special program for them, as you said. Take them to the show or art and craft or the music, or
absolutely,
depending, we had coming, and they really loved it, and they became good friends, because they were there all day. And unfortunately, due to Corona, we haven't had it for, a couple of years, but hopefully we will continue with that, because it's really very, very important. So,
one of the examples I'll say really quickly is we call it Y Care, and it's a day-long program where it helps kids kind of hone their skills. You know, they're doing a lot of things to help a family member, but no one's really ever taught them how to do it. But the goal is to have them meet healthcare professionals, but also other kids. So they spend the whole day with other children and youth, and they learn about like each other, and they feel less isolated and more social support. So that is an absolutely critical way to do it. I'm being asked to repeat the name. Yes. So I'll get let me go back to the actual name of it because I don't want to say it wrong. It's a graphic novel, and it's called Real Kids Talk About ALS. And again, it's a graphic novel. You can get it in hard copy or you can get it in PDF. It's called Real Kids Talk About ALS. And that all of my books they use all of my interviews, all of my research, and they're all the words of the kids. All of the books include all the words of the children and youth. So, so it's really, really very targeted to them.
So Melinda, the question is, I know you touched when parents are protective of children, they don't want to tell them. We do have children who are protective of the parents with ALS. And of course, most of it is culturally. They come from the background that they don't want the parents to know. So they come outside and either grab us or grab the doctor and say, please don't tell my parent, my father or my mother that, you know, they have ALS. So how do you handle that situation?
That's a really tough one. You know, it's hard when you have what's almost like a clashing of cultures, right? Because in the US medical system, that patient has every right to know their own disease, their own progression. But then you have family who's really embedded in a culture that says, we don't tell our elders this. So it can be very, very, very tricky because that patient has every right to know. So what you want to be able to do is ask them, what do they want? What do they want to know? Do they want to know about their own healthcare? Because, you know, they're the ones who are personally feeling it. So it's one thing to say, and this comes up a lot in diagnoses like cancer, right? Where you might not immediately know that that's what you have. You're going about your everyday life and you don't realize that there's a tumor somewhere. And so it's easy to kind of ease into it. But with something about ALS, where your losses can come fast and furious, it feels almost unfair not to let that patient know what's happening right now, unless there is a cognitive impairment that might limit their ability to actually understand it. I really, really, really encourage people to talk with the patient and ask them, or sorry, the person living with ALS, what do they want to know? Have that conversation with the physician, because the physician is going to have to talk to the person with ALS. They can't just ignore them and not share it. But, you know, it has to be a really good open conversation, because that's where that cultural piece comes in. And we can't ignore it. We can't ignore that cultural piece, but we also have to be very respectful of what that patient wants. And the information they want to get. Yeah, it's a tough one.
It is very tough, especially if the patient doesn't speak the language. So it's not easy to reach that patient, and then you don't know what the family is translating. Of course, we have the translator that they are there on the phone and all that, but it is a sort of a sticky situation that
yeah, that patient deserves to be able to know.
Yeah,
you know, they really do.
Yeah,
you know, it's their body that is changing,
sure.
and you know, it's not the family's body. I mean, I get it completely, but that patient deserves to know.
Yeah, and also, of course, going back, we do have this YPG that they call, Young Professional Group. They've been involved with our association for quite a few years now. They are very active, and they raise a lot of money, and they help, they are involved with ALS one way or the other. So it is a very a great group, and if we have anybody wants to join them. And also we do have books that we can send it, by mail. If anybody wants it, just reach out to us, and we will be able to do that. So,
did I talk too fast? I might have talked too fast.
No, but do you have anything else you want to say, or you want me to get another question, couple of questions?
No, I mean, it really just depends if anybody had any other questions. I think I think I was fairly thorough in my slides, but I am absolutely happy to address, readdress anything.
I think you've been very, very good. But just one thing, what happened if the child is so angry? And, it's just, how do you handle that anger?
So sometimes the anger can come from something we call anticipatory grief, right? So we always think that grief is when something ends, something dies. But this idea of anticipatory grief is, this thing is going to happen. Right? Someone is going to die from whatever disorder this is, and we're anticipating it. We're seeing all those little losses. We're seeing all those little changes. And in children, they don't always completely understand immediately how to deal with those losses. And so it can manifest in anger and in frustration and outbursts. So what would be incredibly important is, as soon as possible, get that child engaged with a counselor, a social worker, someone who can help them process through that anticipatory grief. Because, we put a lot on our children, but they aren't able to really process in the same way. And even into adolescence, they have a hot brain anyway. Adolescents are just hot and cold. And so you add this onto it, they need that opportunity to be able to process and work through it. So I would say that probably the most important, or the most kind of primary cause of that anger, is that they just, their parent or grandparent is going to die and they have no idea how to deal with it.
Okay. Any recommendation for how patient may connect with adults who lost a parent when they were child? I love to have that information.
Yeah, so I want to make sure I understand that, Jordan, really clearly. So how someone who is living with ALS, they lost their parent, right? And no, I'd like to, so any recommendation for pals may connect with adults who lost a parent when they were a child.
Yeah.
Yes. So so you're the one living with ALS and you lost a parent as a child, and you want to be able to connect so that kind of understanding of losing a parent is really important. I would say probably your best bet is to go through your local chapter, or I'm trying to think of where would be the first line for that population. I would say probably your local chapter of the ALS Association. Someone without ALS who is an adult now. Okay, so the person who's living in a family with ALS, they lost their parent as a child. That can be generational grief and generational trauma. And I would highly encourage you to speak to someone about it, because if you were someone who lost your parent and now you're in a relationship with someone who is dying with ALS and your children are going to lose their parent, that can be very overwhelming and very, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, it's something that's kind of passed down whether we intend it to or not. I would highly encourage you to talk to a counselor or a social worker about that and kind of be able to process through it. But please tell me if I got what you were asking.
Adele asking question, if you have written any books about adults.
You know, I have not, but I have recently been asked if I would. So I may actually, I may be doing that soon, but right now I have 5 books and they're all really targeting children and families, but there is a need for that adult book as well. Yeah, it's a great question, Adele. Thank you.
So I think we are coming to the end of our session. Thank you so much, Melinda. It was wonderful. Thank you, seeing you in person. And the next session will be at 1 o'clock, Untangling ALS. So hope to see you then. And
All
thank
right.
you again.
Take care.
for
Thank
joining us.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.